Today, I want to talk about how to make a cinematic boss fight, something that'll be challenging and meaningful to the players, fun and resonate. Let's jump right into it. So I've been running a Deadlands campaign, which has been a ton of fun. And the main reason it's been fun is because of the characters, and the players behind them. The players have been doing things with their characters that are just cool. Tying into all of the leads that I give them, the NPCs, the opportunities, the story of it, they dig into it, they add their own little bits, and they make it super awesome. So that is the main reason we're having fun, and I'll talk more about those kinds of things in future videos, as I have in the past on my blog and in videos. But I want to talk about something very cool that happened recently, is that I had the opportunity to do back-to-back 2 sessions with neat, challenging boss-type fights. And this is because we're getting to the end of our Deadlands campaign. And I'll say right now, it doesn't matter that I'm running Deadlands or if I'm running 5th edition. Everything here is going to be for any RPG, really. And we'll talk about the differences in RPGs a bit, but it matters less what the system is and more of the approach. And we're going to talk about the approach. So I just ran 2 back-to-back sessions where there were some pretty challenging fights, difficult, epic, cinematic, where the players had to dig in, right? They had to think, how do I handle these situations? Strategy, and also that it mattered. Like, they wanted to know what was going on in this fight. They cared about which way the fight went. There were choices and options that they might enjoy or regret, depending on how it all plays out. Their actions matter, right? And it's relevant to the larger story that we've been talking about. So the first fight was really neat for me. This is something that I just whole cloth made up as a way of sort of pulling together various parts of the story. The adventure that we're running is called Horror at Headstone Hill. It's an interesting and neat adventure, but it revolves around a city. It's very sandboxy with many different options. And as I've realized where we are in the campaign, how the players are reacting, it's clear that it's time to sort of draw some things together towards a conclusion. And one of the things I did was combine a couple of NPCs together that are in the story that the players had not even run into, but they'd maybe heard a little bit about and they're trying to figure out, and they knew something was going on involving railroads and like actual railroads, with trains, where bandits were stopping them, and for some reason they'd started to figure out those reasons. And there is so much else that we've got yet to do in the campaign that it made sense to close off this arc about who is doing banditry on the trains. It was a good time to bring that together. And I wanted to do that in a way that would feel really epic, like a really neat fight that would be memorable, using terrain, using lots of neat tricks, which we're going to talk about in this video. And what I then wanted to do was to take the, in addition to all of this, which is relevant to the plot, this was also an opportunity for me that I'd been planning for a while to resolve a piece of character backstory. One of the characters had a mystery as to exactly why people kept attributing shootings, killings to his character. And so he got an opportunity to meet his doppelganger. So that was my boss in this first fight. So you can see down below the actual terrain that I used for this cinematic boss fight. I really wanted to put the cinematic. As you can see, I used a combination of Dwarven Forge and a drawbridge made out of popsicle sticks that my son made in middle school quite some years ago. I swore back then, I will use this in a game. It took me a long time. But I delivered. I did it. I finally did it, son. I told you. And it's a neat drawbridge. The drawbridge actually opens in that seam in the middle that you can see there. It's really neat. I used water tiles from an old set of 4th edition tiles, which are actually for Dark Sun. Why they had water in there, we never figured out, but they have water in that set. And so this gave us a little more of a grid. I didn't even bother putting a grid on the top. I thought about it, but my players are fine. They know I'm not out to get them. And so I didn't even bother. They could just use the rest of the terrain to estimate differences. Behind what you see, there was the other half of it on the other side was also sort of exciting, cool terrain, and they could move on either side of it. And there are a number of ways that I came about designing this encounter, which, as I said, I made this entire thing up using some of the monsters or foes that are already in the adventure, combining some others. And I created a lot of options for me. which is a key that we're going to talk about. I had a lot of options as to how I would go about this fight and how it would play out. There were no certainties in my mind, or very few, let's say, because, and that's kind of my approach towards boss battles, is to leave a lot of possibilities and have tricks that I can turn to, toggles that I can turn up and down. So that was very important for me. So let's talk about the first thing that I look at with boss design. And it's a combination of two things, but specific to boss battles, I like to start with the boss and knowing your boss. Now, this also can be part of knowing the overall story of the adventure. What this means is that if you know where your boss fits into the story arc that you're on, you know the importance of that boss, right? In this case, my boss was the key that joins all of the bandits that are attacking the railroads to the person that organizes a 3-part crime syndicate in this adventure. And by the way, I'll have a little bit of spoilers, but really so few that I think that if you were to play this, it wouldn't matter. So I'll try to avoid direct spoilers. Most of my emphasis will be on the things that I did that won't necessarily at all come out the way you would play the adventure during your run. All right, so here in this case, I knew this boss was going to join together, provide an answer, right? Of lead them directly to the person that's organizing these other, this triad of crime groups that had been involved in this town. And they've been trying to figure this all out for some time. So this was a big resolution of that. So the boss needed to provide that glue and be clear as that element. There was also a sub boss that they have met and known is a problem, and sort of had some view of in one of the taverns in town. So bringing them out also provided a little resolution and made them an interesting sort of secondary threat. And then what I did that was custom is my boss had an additional tie-in to the characters because, as I said, they were actually the mystery resolution of a part of backstory that one of the characters had come up with. Right? They had said, people keep attributing things I've done to me when I didn't necessarily do them. And so this boss was not just the crime boss, but also a doppelganger who has been shadowing the character for quite some time and came here to take over this role and play this main bad guy, in part because he wanted to be near where this character was and continue to sort of foil them and feed off of their activities. So this provided a lot of resolution for that character and created a sort of standoff in the Old West type of, duel at noon, right? During the fight, the two of them I figured would go at it. And I'll show you how I did that. So what are the motivations of my boss? I'm thinking through, my boss is here to try to destroy this railroad. He wants to succeed at that, but this is also a personal battle where he wants to take down these the posse of heroes that have been meddling with his affairs, and perhaps either try to recruit the bad guy, the good guy he's been emulating, Ed, or kill Ed. Right. So either join me and finally let us actually be a team, and I no longer have to keep emulating you, or I will actually destroy you because I'm better than you and always have been. And in fact, I'm the real you, right? There was that kind of angle to it. So this was actually a lot of fun during the fight to communicate pieces of this motivation as they were shooting each other and force everybody to think about it. And there was a lot of fun with it for all the players to kind of see that play out and this mystery that they only knew a little bit about kind of come out to the front. With bosses, it's important to think about what the boss is capable of doing. How do you highlight their best actions? This is a game that is not, on Mastering Dungeons podcast, you can see in those videos, or on the podcast, you can listen to us talk about the bosses in that system are very full of really awesome, amazing features. Deadlands tends to be a lot more mundane. They may shoot quickly or shoot a lot of bullets, but it's pretty, it's just people shooting at you or monsters that are doing their one interesting thing. So in this case, there were not a lot of actions to motivate. And in fact, what I thought worked here differently than in the next encounter is that I actually was going to have them be that boss in a movie that stays out of sight, but they're there, you just can't get to them. And then you finally get to fight them in sort of the dark alley. That was my thought about how I would reflect that they've been operating behind the scenes, was that they actually would not figure in the beginning. and the other bad guys would carry that weight. So the reverse of maybe what I'm suggesting, you're highlighting the best actions. In this case, it was about stealth and taunting you from afar. The boss did, however, call out their foes, which was good. They tried to make it emotional. They tried to make it personal by communicating constantly, even from the shadows, taunting Ed and his companions about everything that he's been responsible and how they're going to suffer. And an important part to that was that I knew probably this boss is going down. I didn't have escape plans, though it was possible that they could get away with it, but I thought that was really doubtful. And so what I was thinking about is their defeat, how they would be over time giving out information, and upon their death, this system in particular with Savage Worlds and Deadlands, when you die, you're sort of incapacitated more than anything else, and then you can be ended. So they would be in that sort of incapacitated state and could provide additional information, which did happen in a very neat kind of scene between the two characters. The character and the NPC was really neat. So these are important things for your boss, right? I've given you some examples, but if you go through a checklist like this, and there are other things I do as well, but these are big things I think through, this will serve you really well to know how to make that boss resonate. And something I always say to folks about battles is, think about when you're creating an encounter, a really neat dynamic boss battle. If the fight is totally easy, will it still be awesome? This is especially important at high level play, but it's true at all levels. And if you think through these kinds of boss motivations and doing some neat flashy things, they're making it personal. They're going to give you information, and their defeat will matter in some way, how that's going to play out and resonate. This will mean that even if your players have the easiest time of it, it'll still be really cool, right? So that's a lot behind this. So you can see in the image down below, looking at that bridge, they began actually at opposite ends of the bridge. The foe actually revealed themselves and slipped into the darkness of a tunnel. So if you think on either side, imagine a train tunnel on either side. So they slipped into the darkness where they couldn't be shot at and could just kind of periodically taunt them with their voice. So I like to start by thinking through a boss, but just as important, you could really do these in either order, is to set the cinematic scene. And here, I actually did this one first, though I immediately was thinking about the boss. Setting a cinematic scene is all about saying, if this is a boss battle, it should be neat, right? That you don't want to do this in just a plain room. So this was obviously far from it, right? This neat drawbridge that can open up, the terrain, you can scramble down the sides. In fact, I made it so you could approach either by water or through the tunnel. So you could travel around the land, you could take a boat. There are a number of ways you could arrive and start in this map on either side and then meet the foes. And there were foes mixed throughout, right? The terrain is very interesting. There are things to possibly jump from, climb down, scamper across. The drawbridge might open. There are hidden foes, right? There's a lot going on here, but it just looks epic. And the way I go about creating a cinematic scene is the way that somebody would make a movie, which what they will do is they'll have an idea for it, and they will send out a location scout to wherever they're filming, whatever country location they are in. And the location scout goes around and looks around like, okay, I need a gorge. Which of these, possible gorges will be the neatest one to set this scene in? You want to do that like in your brain. Be your brain's location scout and think about, okay, how am I going to set this up? Even if you're just drawing it, right? Like you might not use 3D terrain, you might not even use minis, but how do you plan through this and think about this? And you could think of it like, even if you're doing theater mind, right? You could say, okay, I'm going to have a bridge. There are going to be tunnels. You could approach from those tunnels out of the darkness into the light. You could come scampering along the hillsides on either side, or you could be either walking along the shallow water or bring a boat up to come into this area. And you start building this 3D model in your brain or sketch it out, whatever you want to do, to think through, what does this location look like so that it's cinematic, that if somebody were to paint it, it would look awesome, right? And let's say it's not something like this. Let's say it's something like, in the next encounter, I'm going to talk about a barn that's the site of a terrible ritual that's taking place. In that case, the dilapidated barn, parts that might fall apart, oil lanterns that are on the sides, the old furniture, the loft up above with a kind of narrow catwalk around it, right? Thinking through these kinds of neat things, and like maybe there's an outhouse outside, which is probably a really bad idea to go into in a horror film. So you know that, and they probably, the characters will know that, and it's just about whether they decide to. But that's cinematic, right? What about that outhouse? Do we go there? No, right? So set that up. And as part of a cinematic scene, I've written some notes here, like wonder and excitement, right? The excitement of this gorge. And you can't not look at terrain like this and think, I might fall, right? Or in the barn, as much as that might not be a wondrous place, there can be some wondrous elements. In this case, I'm not going to give total spoilers, but something was maybe feeding off of people or changing people. So that was very wondrous. And the excitement of, hey, this barn has multiple levels. There's danger. Parts of it could fall. It might get lit on fire. Right? That can bring some excitement to that sort of scene that you're in. When you create a cinematic scene, you want to protect the vital parts of your encounter. And it can be useful as you're setting it up to think about this, right? This happens a lot in games like Dungeons and Dragons, right? If the Lich is the linchpin of the encounter, they are providing the challenge of this encounter, then we don't want them just standing out on a podium with a few obviously minor creatures around it, such that the heroes come in, target the Lich in round 1, take them down to 0 hit points, and the battle is over, right? We want to think through how the terrain itself serves a protection mechanism. So in the first battle with the bridge, I did this through the addition of the tunnels, right? These darkened tunnels on either end meant that somebody could go into the darkness, and now you can't be targeted with spells. You can't be shot at very easily, right? So it was a disincentive for anybody to deal with the boss too early on. I wanted them focused on the rabble. I could have easily had something like, they ride in on a horse and ride off, or and behind cover, or they, anything like that. You can think through how this applies. In the second battle, it was actually the opposite, in that as written in the encounter, which I modified a little bit, but as written in the encounter, the boss that's in that fight is a kind of cultist spellcaster. And this is all about revealing their importance in this encounter and to the plot. And the idea is they're a little bit mad and kind of cackling and happy to die for the horrible creature that's going to be revealed in this encounter. So you don't have to protect the vitals. You can actually gun them down pretty quickly because something else is scarier. So that is where you don't have to, right? Because of this, because you know that. But yeah, think through, if the encounter is dependent on certain monsters surviving, then you want to protect them, give them an out, give them a place to hide. Think through ways that they can get out of, say, area of effect spells that are going to be centered on them, causing damage every round or something like that. Think through that, the capabilities of your characters, and whether you need to do something to protect them, to give them teleportation or whatever it might be, a rope that they can get out of, right? Swing on the chandelier, whatever it might be, that they could use to get out of there. Next one, useful terrain. You can see the neat looking terrain here, but it's less about that it looks neat and that it was useful. So things were happening down below underneath the tracks of this train and the bridge that you see there. So as the characters started moving around, they came to understand that and started to go down below and explore with what was going on. And I'll just go ahead and tell you what was going on, which is that on either side of the bridge, explosives were being primed to take out the train that was going to come by later. And I had enemies hidden under both sides. I allowed notice checks, which my players are so good at failing. And so they actually kind of got they just got a little bit of a success on the closest one. They never figured out the second one. So the second one was part of, I'll talk about this a little more, but an option. Maybe I'll use this second explosive, depending on whether they needed it, whether it made sense in the way the encounter was playing out. But the first one I knew was going to go off. I wanted to start with a bang, if you will, in that there was probably going to be an explosion unless they saw it and stopped it. One character did hear something, and they began to travel down to explore what was going on, but they didn't do so quickly enough, and they were not very good at their noticing. So they didn't stop the bomb. And when the bomb went off, right around a couple of characters were approaching the drawbridge, it stuck the drawbridge in the up position, making that terrain interesting. Later, a character was able to go out and kind of heroically break the beam that had been bent upwards and cause the drawbridge to come down, which is very cool. So that was useful. They were able to do something there and cause it to behave the way they wanted to and get across. But also meant that they went down and engaged with the people who had set that explosion, because now they knew we were there. And that's where the terrain had various utility, right? You can climb onto this big rock that you see in this image down below and jump onto places. You could scamper down the roots that you see that go down there. You could climb down those. You could go a long way around, which is what one of the faster characters did, to move around the circumference of the area and come down and engage the enemy that was below. And if you like this kind of advice, check out the book Forge of Foes, which is over this shoulder right there. Forge of Foes is an awesome book where we have a number of discussions around how to use terrain effectively, how to make interesting encounters, not just boss battles, though we have those as well, but how to make really neat encounters that have a lot of interesting bits to them, the way you see in this image. And it's probably obvious to you by now listening to all this, but tactics and choices are really important to me in boss battles. They're good in all encounters, but especially in boss encounters and big cinematic scenes, having that the characters can make choices. And I started at the very beginning, before they'd even seen the encounter, and this was all covered up with cloth. I said, hey, you know where on the map this railroad is. You know that it's a kind of gorge. You could come down the train tracks through these dark tunnels. You could go around the edge, or you could go down along the waterline. What do you want to do? And they chose to go through the tunnel. So that right there drove sort of how the scene would happen, because they walked out into the bright light and saw the foes at the far end. They were now all elevated. None of them were down below. They could have even split up. So having those kinds of choices, and later there were more, right? Do you want to force open this drawbridge so it collapses back down? Who wants to go across to the other side? Or do you want to stay back and defeat the foes that are here versus trying to get to the ones that are on the other side? There are a number of sort of choices. And then there are, of course, significant choices like, when you finally have defeated your foe, do you finish them off? Do you take them in for justice, right? There were story type choices that were neat too, but there was a lot of tactical choice in this encounter. Characters had to think, and players had to think, do I want my character to scramble down and engage these, or should I run try to jump over the top of this drawbridge? There were a lot of questions like that that they had to think about. And something I really like doing is, there were no perfect immediate options or answers, right? It's a choice that you have to kind of go with your gut, or what your character might do with the available information, because it's not obvious that one thing is superior to the other. So I like doing that. There were also options for my foes and triggers that could trigger what my foe would do or not do. So for example, there was a second bomb on the other side of the bridge. And of course, the main bad guy knows this and is staying out of that blast radius. And I'm holding some bad guys in reserve to trigger that. But this was an option for me. Had the battle been going so against the characters that the characters were too hurt, couldn't handle it, that second bomb would have vanished, right? There is no reality, as I see it, in encounter design. Even the things I've written in books, I don't see that as some truth to the world. It is what I designed for most tables. It should be fun for most tables. But if it isn't, you should change it. And it's the same thing with my homebrew stuff. When I'm creating something, I give myself these options. Maybe there's a second bomb, maybe there isn't, and it depends on whether that would be fun, because ultimately I'm creating a fun combat, right? There were also triggers. So for example, there was a spellcaster, and she began play hidden, because a lot of times spellcasters, if you go out into the blight and you cast a really neat spell right off the bat, you are the obvious thing to attack. So she waited until characters were a little engaged with other monsters. Then she came out and cast a dark spell, and she drew some attention, but it wasn't like the lightning rod that it can be if you put him out there too early. I also had a trigger around a couple of character enemies that had flamethrowers, which can be pretty serious. And they came out at sort of in stages, so that wasn't overwhelming. And in fact, they did deal devastating damage, which the characters then used, or the players used special options to counter. So every one of my 3 flamethrowers ended up being a critical failure that just exploded in the face of this person using it, which was kind of fun. But those were all triggered to things they did. And the last tier is baking in goals and questions, the campaign's questions and goals, right? So as part of the tactics of this comes with, for example, the sub-boss. Some of them may have had a kind of personal hatred towards them. So do you go right for them, right? That's baked into this tactics, is how much do you hate this? Similarly for Ed, with his doppelganger, someone who looks just like him and is dressed like him, just going into the shadows. Well, do you just go all out and go after them, hunt them down? Or do you help take down these other bad guys, which is what they chose to do? But they're tough questions, again, with no right answer. You just have to decide, do I want to do this? What does my character do? And it's imperfect, but you're having fun with the results of that, right? And see how it pans out. And I don't even know how it's going to pan out entirely. But having these kinds of goals and questions beyond the larger goal of, stop this railroad from being blown up, is a very good one. And so this all figured into the tactics and choices that both sides were using. I should talk a little bit about my second fight and the tactics and choices it had. You can see an image from that second fight. This is the bottom story of the 3-story floor plan. And there were a bunch of characters in here that had some creatures threaten. There were, NPCs in here that had creatures, let's say, threatening them in a sort of sci-fi horror-y type of way. You could think the movie Alien, maybe. Imagine that they're the face hugger opening things, something like that. And so one of the tactics and choices was, what do you do? Do you go for these cultists? Do you go for these creatures that are, and so of course they went after what, I figured they would do is they went after to take care of these things, the kind of face huggery type things that were going on, because that made a lot of sense to protect the NPCs. And to make it really resonate, one of the NPCs is actually an NPC that one of the characters is likely to marry. They've already asked to marry them. And so this was very personal to save her. So they did things that, their choices were brave because of this, right? To try to take out these various foes. And those foes actually did not fight them. So they were essentially taking time to deal with this threat to others, which meant that there were a lot of bad guys that were not defeated early that could face them. And so that tactics was impactful, and it did play out over time because they took a lot of damage from all of these cultists that were standing through the first couple rounds. A big part of this boss cinematic encounter design is the plot resonance, right? When you're making a big, awesome fight, it will be bigger and more awesome if you think through how it's impacting the plot, right? It's one thing to just stumble into a dungeon and you decide to go left and, oh, look, there's a huge pyramid and on it some, terrible undead thing and, shadows, and you fight those. And that's a really cool fight. But unless you already knew who that undead creature was and the meaning of the pyramid, it doesn't have a lot of plot resonance, right? It might later, you learn the history of the pyramid, and that can be perfectly fun. But when you want it to really resonate, you want to tap into that plot resonance, right? Where maybe your characters had visions of that pyramid, or the undead has already been a plague upon the land, impacting your friends, right? Your NPC friends. So that's the kind of thing that I look for in these kinds of boss battles, which requires thinking about your encounters as part of your larger plot that you've been steadily working on, right? If this boss battle will impact the PCs and their plots, the plots they care about, that they are maybe themselves doing, right? If somebody's trying to buy a business and the foe is the one who owns the deed and has been unwilling to sell or has been manipulating the person who would sell, that's pretty important, right? If defeating them or having them escape will impact the story, or for example, for this fight that you can see the image of down below, there will be a huge story impact if the NPC that a character is trying to marry doesn't make it. Let's imagine that one of the NPCs is a mayor and they were the voice of reason in the town, right? And must be protected at all costs. Otherwise, the bad leader will take over the town. Well, that's a huge story impact. You're saving that storyline, right? It can also be neat if this plot, if this battle will impact the story that is developing, right? It's either going to further the story, take us further along an arc, or resolve an arc. So I mentioned how in the previous one, there was an arc around trains being derailed for purposes of one of the other nefarious bad guys. That resolution, that important boss battle resolved that story arc, tied it off with a bow. You are the heroes, you defeated that, you finished that. So on your list of things to do, one of them is closed off. That makes it really memorable, right? We might similarly, in fact, in this fight down below, the second fight in the barn, defeating that cultist magic user resolved the questions around their involvement and changes the nature of the town significantly. Again, tying off one of the story arcs and helping them progress along the few remaining ones. Plot resonance is also achieved if the PCs are making important choices that drive the plot, right? Let's imagine that the character had not decided yet to marry that NPC, but after this fight, they might, right? Or whether they decide to free a boss, right? Let them go, or take them into custody, or murder them, right? Or whatever you want to call it. Take them out for being evil, administer justice through their own hands. Those important types of choices make a difference. And so we can think about that when we're drafting out our encounter, our boss battle, to think like, okay, what kind of big choices could they make about the resolution of it, about the participants in it? Maybe there's an artifact. Do you destroy it? Do you take it back with you? Do you give it to the authorities? Do you give it to someone else, right? That's a really big important. They had another battle where they recovered some artifact, where the artifact was actually something that was a Christian artifact, but had been in the hands of a Native American shaman. And so who should you give it to? And there were some other items. So what they actually did is, I thought they were going to keep those items and deal with the artifact, but they give the majority of the artifacts to the tribe in the area, and then kept the one, sort of saying, but we will honor what your people were trying to do, right? And that was a neat part of those choices of what to do with those artifacts that they'd recovered, and how much you wanted to use it to power yourself up versus resolve the story and do what might feel like it's right. You can see down below in this image the 2-story house, 2 stories, and there's the roof above it. This is from something called Terraclips, really neat terrain. Kind of clips all together, and very neat kind of cardstock that you can use. And you can see the corner of the outhouse over to the side. They were wise enough to never go to the outhouse. But this was neat because I could take the 3, set the scene from afar and make it look interesting. And once they got to it, which involved already a fight, then I could take it apart and show the first story and the second story, and they could fight in both. But let's talk a bit about more around that resolution aspect with rewards and information. And this is something really important about a boss fight. We can put so much energy into crafting the boss fight as DMs, GMs, that we then realize, what did they get for participating in that? And what's the payoff beyond just defeating the bosses? And defeating is good. That can carry the day too. But we want to think through, do they get any equipment as rewards, right? Whether it's something as simple as healing potions, or it's that awesome magical blade. Is it the holster that lets you, quick draw? It's those kinds of things. Something useful can be good. And depending on the amount of magic and power in the campaign, boss battles are a great place to have some of those. I see Deadlands as being pretty equipment low. So I've been giving out a fair amount. So there were not a ton of equipment-based rewards, but there was some really nice kind of mechanically enhanced gear here that had both a monetary value and possibly utility value. So some of them kept it for that utility, where they can now, shoot more and hit harder. And some of them cashed it in so that they could buy things they wanted, like armor. Right? So there was some equipment value here. Really important, actionable information, right? If you hear the name of the boss that controls the triad of gangs, that's really cool information. The very next session, they've used that information and acted on it, right? So it was useful, actionable information, which counts as a reward. Resolving questions. Huge reward for the player whose backstory now had resolution, right? This backstory was resolved. Do you have another one that a story you've been dealing with, right? Or maybe it's simply resolved and we're all good there, right? And then there are plot questions, not just your character questions, but resolving the plot questions. Who is behind the railroad attacks? Who is behind these cultist things? And what exactly is the cult trying to do with the people they're capturing? That got resolved, which was horrifying, but now they know. And it led towards also information of, from this barn, where do we go next? They now know that. Tying up and starting arcs. A boss battle is great for tying up an arc, but it also can provide that next piece. And in fact, I think that the characters for the second battle with the barn didn't really think of this as necessarily an arc, or they just had a little inkling of it. But this now takes them to the conclusion. The next place they will go will conclude this arc around this sort of almost sci-fi horror element that's here. In the case of the earlier battle on the bridge, that resolved that arc that was around the train attacks. The last thing you could do as rewards and information is you can provide resources towards goals, and resources can be a lot of different things. But let's say you're playing in 5th edition, I have your bastion, right? Something that helps you build a bastion or run a bastion can be cool. It can be something like, if you're using the Acquisitions Incorporated franchise, something that would let you get extra downtime to use to increase what your franchise does would be awesome, right? If you have specific goals in mind, someone's trying to run a bakery, or somebody's trying to track down what happened to the pirate ship their father was on. Anything that furthers those goals helps you towards that is useful, whether it's monetary, leads, clues, things that fuel what you're trying to get towards is exceedingly helpful and feels like a really important reward that beats out gold pieces, right? Which is a lot of what I think you'll see in this list that I have here. This is stuff that's more fun than just saying you got 20 gold, right? It is towards the goals of the story, the campaign, the characters. So the last item I want to share about creating cinematic boss battles is the idea of contingencies and surprises. This will depend heavily on the type of game you're running and how well it structures its encounter building. So Deadlands, it does not have something like in D&D where you have CR, right? But by understanding that lack of encounter building, lack of tiering or anything like that, and that they're just monsters, some of them are harder than others, it doesn't super tell you what to use when, right? That means that I know I can't count on the challenge being a certain way. I just don't know what will happen in the fight. So I have to surrender that degree of control I might have in some other systems and think through how to deal with that, right? Pick monsters accordingly, and keep some possibilities in ways that I can still surprise the character or toggle that challenge. Challenge toggles is something like where I said that, there was the second bomb under the other bridge that doesn't have to be there, right? I can decide where the battle should have that explosion or not based on how much the characters needed it. For example, had they not defeated all three of the flamethrower wielding characters, I probably wouldn't have used that explosion because they would have been so hurt by AoE attacks that having, nitroglycerin or dynamite explode on them would have been just probably too much. But because they were so good at that, they could benefit. It was a little more fun, have a little more challenge. And so that was something that I turned on in a possible toggle, right? That I had that ready. I had the rules there. I knew what the blast radius was. I was ready to do it if the challenge was necessary. But there are other things that I didn't decide to toggle. For example, the boss. The boss themselves, when they finally revealed themselves towards the later third of the battle and stepped out into the light, now they could be a target, and they were shooting at Ed. Ed was shooting at his doppelganger. I did not want any toggles for that person. I wanted that to just play out however it goes. If immediately Ed takes down his doppelganger, cool, you're that much better, right? If, on the other hand, the other guy takes down Ed, so be it, and it's up for his friends to avenge him or help him, recover him, and so on, and vanquish his enemy for him. That might be a little dissatisfying, but it would also show the strength of that friendship, right? And that would be the story, right? So that one was not on toggles. The boss was the boss. It was just that decision of when to move in and out of the darkness was all that there really was there. I talked about optional surprises, right? Thinking through what else you can bring in that might make it neat. So The drawbridge getting stuck in the opposition was something I knew I wanted there as a sort of terrain surprise, right? There was a time when one of the enemies, the enemy spellcaster, tried to run away by going into the water and escaping, and she had a fair amount of information. So that caused a character to do something special to actually promise to her, we will let you go if you tell us what you know, don't run away. And so she hung out there on the rocks instead of, trying to jump into the rapids and swimming away. So optional surprises like that are really neat, that kind of thing that makes you make decisions and what to do. The big surprise in this second encounter, you can see right below me, which was there was a bunch of like wooden crates and stuff piled together in a corner, that then bursting out of it was this horrible plant creature. And it was very tough. And so that as a surprise, when you realize you're not just fighting this small army of cultists and an NPC who turns out to be a cultist spellcaster, you're dealing with this really horrid plant thing. That was a really neat surprise. Not optional in this case, but a surprise. But it is nice to have optional elements. For example, one of the spellcasters could summon zombies. So that was a neat surprise. I thought I might not do it if I didn't need it, but because a couple of the characters were hanging outside and not coming into the structure, I had that happen as a way to bring in the battle to them. Always important is to understand your encounter building rules. And here it's less about knowing exactly what the rules are, but knowing the limitations, right? When you know that in 5th edition 2014, at many CRs that were higher CRs, it would be just too weak, right? Or knowing that in 2024 5th edition, they hit really hard, especially at the low levels, and you have to be careful about building too deadly an encounter, right? For Deadlands, it's knowing that there are no encounter building guidelines, and so I don't really know how hard this is going to be, and so I need more toggles, right? But understanding that how accurately you're able to assess this, and then making adjustments, adding in those toggles and optional surprises so that you can provide the challenge if challenge is fun. So I don't look at challenge as a must-have, right? I don't have to have the characters on the ropes or the players all standing going, oh my God, will our characters live? But some of that can be fun. So I want the potential for that. And what I do want is the characters responding to situations, less about whether they're going to live or die and more responding to situations. The fight here with the barn and that plant creature actually was really terrible, and a character died, though they had a special feature they played to immediately come back, though changed, which is kind of cool. It's called Horrid. And so, knowing that, right, I didn't know that would happen, but I know that the players have various ways to dig deep. And so there was some of it that I was willing to just see how it goes, right, even though it was very tough. In some systems, it's a lot of fun to do this next and last thing, which is understanding the capabilities of your PCs. The more that the game's combat challenge functions around fantastic things the characters to do, the more helpful it can be to do this, and in both directions. So one is, imagine there's a character that can just teleport anywhere. So on one hand, you want to imagine that if you think your boss is, 3 levels up and inaccessible, well, we know they're accessible because this character can just teleport and maybe even teleport other members of the party too. So that is not true, and we should know that's what can happen. But we may therefore put our boss up on some hard to reach area because we know that will be super cool and rewarding for the capabilities of that character, right? Both things can be true. We know that it isn't a, haha, you can't reach me. And so therefore, it can be a reward mechanism. If I run a flat plane, you would run up to me. Well, now I'm letting you use a special thing, and that's cool. But I know that this isn't about the enemy being inaccessible. And if I want to protect the enemy in some way, I have to come up with something else. There's an energy barrier around them, or a clockwork device that blocks all blows until it's destroyed. Whatever it is. If you need to protect your foe, you take into account those PC capabilities. If you are going to have a bunch of minions and your characters can just rain down AoE on them and easily kill minions, again, we might do that exactly to reward the characters for that, but we don't put in a bunch of minions thinking that it'll be this enormous challenge, right? Or we might have waves of them, so we know that they're probably going to use a couple of fireballs or whatever they have, and then they will have to deal with the remaining ones. So that's the kind of thing if you want, where understanding PC capabilities lets you do that fine piece between knowing what your monsters can get away with and how to reward characters for their special things, right? So it's very useful to think through the more that your characters have that. So I hope that this has been helpful. We've talked about boss battles and how I go about them. I'd love to hear from you on what other steps you do when you're designing cinematic encounters, when you want to create something that the heroes will really dig into, your players will come away talking about. How do you design those? Let me know down below. I hope if you enjoyed this. If you did, let me know. Please, the number one thing you can do, yes, obviously, if you thumbs up these things, that's awesome. But especially what's helpful is if you tell someone else about these videos. Share these links out on the social medias and the places where you hang out, the Reddits, the forums. The more that my channel gets out there, it really, really helps me a ton to reach people and try to get awesome things I'm working on, like that awesome secret project I just turned in that I can't wait to tell you about, but I can't yet. So I look forward to hearing your comments, and I'll see you next time.